Burning questions.
Insightful answers.
Listener's choice.
With Clement Manyathela.
So on our Listener's Choice feature today, we are looking at this U.S. refugee status. One of our listeners has asked that we bring in an expert who can explain this U.S. refugee status. Remember, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an order to help the Afrikaner community from South Africa resettle in the U.S. Following those claims of discrimination, land confiscation, or persecution on the Afrikaner community in the country. Now, the latest on this issue, before I bring in the guest, the latest on this issue is that the U.S. President Donald Trump's administration is now planning to turn office spaces in Pretoria into temporary refugee centers so that they can consider this more than 8,000 applications from the white Afrikaners who want to resettle in America. So I saw the New York Times reporting that based on the documents that they have seen, under phase 1 of this program, the United States will be deploying multiple teams to convert commercial space in Pretoria at their offices into ad hoc refugee centers. Or maybe it's going to be commercial space, not even their offices. I don't know what this ad hoc refugee centers will do. I don't know if that means now the people who claim to be persecuted in South Africa can go live in these refugee centers until the U.S. then admits them in America. But according to the New York Times, about 8,200 requests have been received. These are people expressing interest in resettling in the U.S. And so far, the U.S. has identified only about 100 Afrikaners who could be approved for refugee status. So only about 100 so far seem to be the ones that will be approved out of the 8,200. Let's bring in Craig Smith now, who is an immigration lawyer at Craig Smith and Associates. If you've got some questions about this, maybe you considering taking up this offer, you want to know what to do, give us a call or send us a WhatsApp voice note. Craig, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, Clement.
So let's first look at how the U.S. maybe defines refugee status and what are the normal processes that the U.S. follows when they are dealing with refugees.
Sure. Look, the starting point is that way back after the Second World War, when millions of people were displaced, the world effectively got together after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in 1951, there was a Convention for Refugees in which the definition of refugee still remains intact. The U.S., just like South Africa, adopts the same definition, which is to the tune of, and it relates to persecution. It says those individuals who are outside of their country of nationality, who have a well-founded fear of persecution as a result of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or a social group who feel that they're being persecuted, may apply for refugee status. So what America does is they add the rights of the President of the United States in certain circumstances to carve out a group that he would consider to be eligible and make a sort of a special law, which we now know is an executive order, to allow for a group, in his opinion, that warrant refugee status. So the difference in terms of all the Western world and Middle East, the rest of the world, all adopt, in essence, the same definition. However, the president has these rights to make regulations or make executive orders to allow for those who are in their country of origin, just like we're talking about the Afrikaner group, who are in the country of their own nationality, who have now been identified by the president to apply for refugee status. Now, you must remember there's a definition between an asylum seeker and a refugee. An asylum seeker is one of those individuals who applies for refugee status but has not yet received refugee status or has been refused. However, refugee status is where they have applied and qualify. So it's a lot more onerous. What the executive order has done is it's essentially set out that if you fall within this specific group.
And how do they define that group, Craig?
Okay. So they define that group as Afrikaners who have suffered racial discrimination. So racial discrimination falls within the ground of refugee status, and they would therefore have the opportunity to apply. President Trump has allowed these people now to go to refugee centers and make application, not just for asylum, but actually fully fledged refugee status in their country of origin, and that's where we are at the moment. If I may say, it's still in its very tentative stages because the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirsty Noem, this is all the political side and the administrative process, has to still build a plan. It has to get approved by Trump. Before they start this process, they call it Mission South Africa, in order to obviously implement this process. Coming to the second part of your question is what would be the processes? So there will be a plan of action. There will be law. There will be rules and regulations, and it will result in those parties, individuals within South Africa. They would have to effectively apply for for refugee status, in which they'd have to go through quite a lot of vetting. They would have to go through security processes to ensure that they are not criminals. They will go through a medical screening process. They will go through a process on the merits. And here's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Is it just if you Afrikaans, and you can show historically there was an issue of racial discrimination that you feel is material, will that be condoned? Will that be accepted? Or how strict or wide will the U.S. missions apply this executive order? Because if they do want to make a wide definition, you are going to have many refugees qualifying.
Yeah, and for me, because when I looked at the requirements, at least looking at the U.S. laws, you need extensive documentation. You need proof of persecution as well. Is there an instance here? And I think that's going to make it difficult, Craig, because what proof of persecution? How many of the 8,000 people who were told have applied are able to say, "Oh, look, I've actually been persecuted in this way," and then they meet that criteria. So what I'm trying to figure out is, could we look at a way where the U.S. administration then widens what is expected for refugees to be able to meet that threshold, so they make it quite easier as opposed to say, give us the proof that you've been persecuted? Because if you are still enjoying braais here and having so much fun, looking happy in South Africa, it's going to be difficult to then get there and say, "Oh, I'm a refugee, I'm being persecuted." You've just enjoyed a wonderful time in your farm having braais with your family.
Yes. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Clement. The issue here is has this whole process been politicized by the president? Because remember, underpinning this executive order has been the criticism that America has of South Africa in participating or effectively fronting the attendance in the International Court of Justice last year about, with the Israeli-Palestinian Hamas war. Why did we not side with Israel? So could we be punished? Could we be punished because they mention the Expropriation Act and arbitrary expropriation of property, which is factually false as would be as an issue, because no property has been expropriated in such a manner without compensation. In fact, I don't think there have been any land expropriations yet. So the question is, if they're trying to punish South Africa, and the relationships are obviously sour, they can, as you suggest, they could make it a very wide decision. And the applicant for asylum, we call it an asylum seeker, attends on this ad hoc refugee center in Pretoria, and they speak about well, what is racial discrimination? Do they say, oh, well, I didn't get into university, or I didn't qualify for a specific position in the employment sector? How far do you go? But if it is the mission of the U.S., it's their underlying intention or non-stated intention, and they apply a wide definition, say, okay, are you Afrikaans? Let's just double-check you are Afrikaans. Let's see your birth certificate and your history. And yes, you are Afrikaans. And ignore the merits of the racial discrimination, and they just get a free pass. Or will they, and should they, which they should, if they are a signatory to international law, they should actually consider the asylum seeker would have an obligation on a balance of probabilities to show he or she has been racially discriminated and effectively persecuted in South Africa. And I don't think it would pass the muster if you said, look, I didn't find a job, or I missed out on this opportunity, I didn't make this sports team or whatever, and I'm an Afrikaans-speaking person. Well, if Mission South Africa and the American politicians and missions want to fast-track this, they will do it, and they will do it in a very quick time.
Yeah. Okay. And then I want to give some listeners an opportunity here, in fact, to ask some questions. So you can call us on 011-883-0702 if you're also trying to understand more about this U.S. refugee status. We're trying to explain it to you with Craig Smith, who is an immigration lawyer at Craig Smith and Associates. Let's start with Gaurelo, actually, who's calling us from Pretoria, who's got a question for us. Gaurelo, good morning.
Morning, yeah. Look, I tend to look at it very simply. Donald Trump wants to save white people in South Africa, and that's his intention. I mean, the American embassy in Pretoria issued a communique saying that this is for Afrikaners initially, and then later they said all descendants of European settlers. That's the wording they used. Now, it seems to me that the intention is to save white people. It doesn't make sense to me that they need any stringent criteria, because then, exactly what would the criteria be? At the heart of it is whether you're white and South African. That should be enough. Secondly, which I think is quite a scary prospect, in fact, is whether they do things like credit checks and so on. In other words, could people who are facing danger for debts or indebtedness in South Africa, who are under financial pressure, find this as an escape valve where they leave their debt here and run off to the States through this free pass? Because essentially, Donald Trump's political aims is to save white people, and that's who he sees as being persecuted. So it doesn't make sense that he could be stringent about it, otherwise he might not as well have it.
So he'll open it and relax the requirements for refugee. I hear you, Gaurelo in Pretoria. Thanks. Yeah, Craig, your thoughts on that?
Yes, we touched on that, Clement. Essentially, how loose is this test going to be applied? We know the test is a test that has been applied for decades and decades. And it's the same for all members of these various refugee instruments. So now, as I think his name was Kabela, he says, well, America comes to South Africa, and I think we can't ignore the politicization and Elon Musk. Elon Musk said he has been previously racially discriminated, and America comes and sort of they turn the law, they turn the tables on the South African government or for the rest of the world. Remember, they've blocked refugees coming into America. So there's an executive order on that, and now there's an executive order that is promoting Afrikaners who've been racially discriminated. So you get the feeling that Donald Trump wants to prove a point. He's not happy with South Africa appearing in the International Court of Justice. So I think he wants to make the point. I think he wants to give white South Africans, it doesn't matter how big or small the group is, but he wants to show that there will be a group of South African Afrikaners that will most likely be approved, because I think he doesn't now want to open up his executive order and not follow through on it. So yes, the test can be applied widely, and the people could, no matter what the story is, they can just grant the refugee status, and that, despite the definition, which is you still got to show persecution, you still got to fall within the test. But if Donald Trump and his political groupings or supporters, disciples, you call it what you like, if they decide it's a wide test, they're not going to get embroiled in too much vetting as to persecution, well, they're going to get it. But maybe he says, look, it doesn't matter what the grounds are. We want 100, we want 1,000 white people, Afrikaner people to come to America. He then proved his point.
Yeah.
Yes.
So another question from one of our listeners is what are some of the benefits that come with this U.S. refugee status? So if these people, let's say 100 or 1,000 or 8,000 get to America, what happens? Do they get given homes? Do they get given jobs? Do they start from scratch?
Well, the question, if Donald Trump was smart, he would be trying to find those refugees that could add value to America. Now, let's just say he's targeting the agricultural sector. If he was smart, he would want to vet these applicants or asylum seekers who clearly have agricultural skills. What if you went to a university and you studied agriculture and you one of the asylum seekers? Donald Trump says, look, I want 1,000 farmers because I'm going to put them in the farming community. Through Elon Musk, he says that the white Afrikaner, he or she is a good worker. So he identifies the farming community if you're smart, right? Now, here's the thing. They will get a free pass into America. They will have South African passports. You don't have to give up your South African passport. And that's also not the norm in refugee protocols. You have to give up your passport. So when you get into America, this is how it would probably unfold. You have to stay in America for over a year. You will then be able to apply for a green card, which is like permanent residence. And flowing from that, you can 5 years later get citizenship. So if that's not a benefit, then I don't know what is.
Yeah. Craig Smith in Cape Town. Thank you for chatting to us. He's an immigration lawyer at Craig Smith and Associate. I hope you understand better now about this U.S. refugee status. To me on the WhatsApp line says, Clement, don't refugees get accommodated in the host countries, not the country that is persecuting them? Because I said to you earlier on that the U.S. is now changing commercial space in Pretoria into ad hoc refugee centers. So Dumi is asking on the WhatsApp line, why are they creating accommodation for them here in South Africa and not in America? I think they want to plant people here under the guise of repurposing whatever buildings they have to convert reasons. I don't know what you mean by that part, Dumi, but I get the question that you're asking there.